I think, figured out pretty quickly that Kona was not something that Kent wanted to continue to invest in. And I know when he told people that, and then we had the embarrassment at Sea Otter, a lot of people were feeling like, oh my goodness, this is the end of Kona. I don't think anybody can really explain what happened. It certainly was very public. I don't think anything quite that publicly embarrassing has happened to a bike brand since Schwinn announced their bankruptcy in the middle of the Cabda show in 1992. Chalk one up for Kona as doing something special. As a joke, I was saying to people, Kent's going to sell Kona, probably going to get a good owner who really cares about bikes. But the problem is, like, who would be crazy enough to want to buy a battered up old bike company right now? Like, it's the worst possible time.
From Escape Collective, this is Overnight Success, the podcast about the entrepreneurs, the personalities, and the passionate people who make up the sport of cycling and the stories behind the icons they've built. It's been said that Kona is the smallest, biggest bike company in the world. They're best known as the quintessential North Shore bike brand, yet their global head office sits just down over the border in Ferndale, Washington. The quirky company stood out from the beginning with outrageous model names such as the Stinky Dee-Lux, the Sex 1, the Sex 2, the Jackshit, which placed them well and truly as an alternative bicycle company. The business was founded by Dan Gerhard and Jacob Heilbron in Vancouver, BC, along with mountain bike Hall of Famer Joe Murray as their designer. With a rich history of iconic bikes and factory race teams, this was all overshadowed by the recent events of their former owners, Kent Outdoors, who were responsible for running Kona into the ground before the original founders bought back the company last month. Only a few weeks after Dan and Jake bought the company back, I sat down and spoke with Jake about Kona's founding story that dates back 36 years to 1988, up to the sale of the business to a private equity-backed company, and what happened that led them to buying Kona back. Hey, so yeah, like, take me back to, you grew up in Toronto and then you took a gap year and rode your bike. Tell me about that.
Well, this was the 10-speed boom days. Maybe not too many of your listeners are going to be familiar with that. I bought a 10-speed bike so that I could ride to school.
Yeah.
And my school, I was in Richmond Hill, Ontario, which was a small town back then. And my school was in Thornhill. So it was like 15-mile round trip, and I bought a Peugeot 10-speed with drop bars and, plastic simplex derailleurs. And, after I graduated from school, and that was when you had 13 years of school in Ontario.
Yeah.
So I decided I'm going to take a gap year. I don't really know what I want to do. And a friend of mine, I bought a couple of bikes down at Bloor Cycle in Toronto. I bought a Dawes Galaxy. He had a Dawes Realm Rider. These are British bikes, and they're still around.
Yeah.
So I got 1428 straight 5 block with a 42 by 52 steel cotter pin strong light crank, and off we went with our little pannier bags and racks, and rode from Toronto across the Rockies to San Francisco.
Wow.
Down to Mexico. I went as far south as Guadalajara, rode back up through Brownsville, Texas, along the Gulf Coast to New Orleans, and got there in time for the Mardi Gras. And then we rode back home, 8-month tour.
Jeez, that's amazing. And you got back to Toronto. And then what brought you back to Vancouver, to the other side again?
Well, I heard you could ride your bike year-round in Vancouver.
So you were caught by the bug.
After 8 months, I still like riding bikes. That's why I picked UBC, and it was easy to get into college back in those days.
Uh-huh.
I just enrolled and studied some useless stuff, and to put myself through school, like I was saying in that little article I wrote, or the letter to the editor I wrote, I was working in a bike shop West Point Cycles at the corner of 10th and Alma, just part-time. And at the end of the school year, they offered me a full-time job. And so I said, yeah, I'm going to try that. Originally my plan was do 2 years, go on a bike tour in Europe and keep exploring that kind of lifestyle. But I ended up in the bike shop and I never got out of the bike business.
And I read that you had a small ownership in Rocky Mountain during its early days. How did that come about?
Rocky Mountain kind of evolved out of the West Point Cycles store chain. It had 5 stores, 4 in Vancouver and 1 in Edmonton. So, back in those days, bike shops sold cheap 10-speed bikes or, steel 3-speed Raleighs, and that was about it. So one year I flew over to Germany with my bike, went to the trade show in Cologne and started finding some good stuff to sell in the shop, lightweight equipment, decent clothing, just to kind of expand it and make it more interesting, really. So that was sort of the start of Rocky Mountain. And right around that time, mountain biking was just getting off the ground, right?
We're talking early 80s?
Late 70s. Late
70s. Wow.
Tom Ritchie and Gary Fisher were making these frames and selling them out of Gary Fisher's bike shop in Fairfax. And at one point, a friend of mine who had a bike magazine in Vancouver, he's an engineer, and he'd gone down to San Francisco and he went to Gary Fisher's bike shop, bought himself a Ritchie mountain bike, brought it back into the store and said, hey, look what I got. And that started kicked it off for me in terms of mountain biking.
Is that right? Your imagination just started, going nuts with what you could do on a mountain bike, or what did you see in the mountain bike?
Well, yeah, I was into road racing in those days, and cyclocross. Yeah. So I kind of already had an affinity for dirt. But our store, we would take 10 speeds and we'd modify them and make them, more interesting, because most people didn't want a drop bar bike with a narrow gear ratio and, sort of sketchy brakes. So we would convert those bikes to flat bars and better saddles and, different gearing, and spent a lot of time messing around with bikes and turning them into something that people wanted. So, when we saw a mountain bike for the first time, it said, yeah, this is actually what people want. Back then it was a fad.
Is that right?
People looked at mountain bikes and said, well, that's really stupid, right? Why would you want a big, heavy bike?
Yeah.
Ride around the dirt. It's like that's like a BMX bike for kids, for adults. It was a dumb idea, but it stuck, obviously. That kind of led to Rocky Mountain Bicycles getting into mountain bikes. It was the first importer of Ritchie bikes anywhere in the world outside of the United States. Then we developed our own brand. We had a little workshop that was making some road frames and some mountain bike frames that we had bought from somebody who went bust. So there was one guy making road frames, and then we met Paul Brody, has his own bike brand. And he was an artist and tinkering around with gear. And Dan, my partner, met him at the bike shop in Vancouver, on East Vancouver. And we convinced him to try making some mountain bike frames. So we got some tubing and he had some welding equipment, and he made up the first 10 mountain bike frames for Rocky Mountain.
Wow.
Yeah, that's kind of how we got Rocky Mountain started.
Yeah, wow.
As a bike brand.
Now there's a whole other story I got to do. I got a huge affinity to Rocky Mountain as well. So what was your kind of role and responsibility within Rocky Mountain at this point?
I was one of the founders. So I was a partner in the bike shop chain. After a few years of working in the bike shop, I said, well, if you want me to stay here, you're going to have to let me buy into some of the action here. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of just evolved into Rocky Mountain, and I was one of the founders of the company, and then it became its own bike brand. So I was only there in the early days. I left in 86.
Yeah. How come you left?
I really couldn't get along with my partner. He was supposed to be really good on the finance side, and I was doing like the bikes and the creative product marketing side. And turned out he wasn't really great at the finance stuff. He ended up selling it twice, and they have great owners now. Rocky Mountain is a solid brand. They do great bikes. They've got a really good thing going, and they've sort of now kind of expanded to be a great global brand too, because before they were just Canadian brand and very focused on the Canadian market. So, good on them for really making their way. Kona took a little bit different path though.
So you left in '86, you said. Where did you go then? What did you do?
I worked for Tom Ritchie for a while.
Oh, really?
Down in the peninsula, and learned a lot. And for a very short time, I was working at Marin Bikes in their early days, and that's where I met Joe Murray. So Joe's not a household name anymore, but like back then, he was the mountain biker, right? He's one of the inaugural members of the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame. He won the U.S. National Championships several times in a row. He was winning all the races because he was from Marin. Marin was the hotbed, the center of mountain biking.
Yeah.
At one point, I said to Joe, let's get out of here. My friend Dan Gerhard has just started his own bike company up in Vancouver. He's repping some other brands. He was doing Brody and Merlin bikes, and he was actually the distributor of Marin in Canada.
Yeah.
And I said, let's go join Dan and start our own bike company, right? We can do better than this.
Yeah.
That's kind of been my mantra, right? If I look at something and I say, well, this is pretty good, but these are the flaws and this is how we can do it better. And that was kind of the approach. And so we went up to Vancouver, we hooked up with Dan, and we started Kona in '88.
And mountain biking was no longer, in your eyes, a fad. This was something that was here to stay. Is that safe to say?
When we started Kona, you couldn't sell anything other than a mountain bike.
Yeah, right.
That was back when people were getting rid of the road bikes. There really wasn't anything exciting or new happening in road bikes. It was all that craftsman stuff that was really cool and amazing from the 60s and 70s, but there wasn't really anything new. And mountain biking was the thing. So we started a mountain bike company.
How did you meet Dan?
He's from St. Louis.
Yeah.
We've got very similar backgrounds. He did graduate from college though. So he's got, that one leg up on me. But he was working in a bike shop, as a teenager and through college. A1 Bikes, it's changed its name, but the store is still there.
Yeah.
And he was bike touring in the Rockies, and he met a woman, and she was from Vancouver. And so he pursued her there and convinced her to marry him. And he walked into the bike shop at West Point one day and said, I need a job. I'm a bike mechanic. And that sort of evolved over time. He ended up managing one of the stores. That's the Bikes on Broadway store. And right above the store, we had a little warehouse space, and that's where Rocky Mountain actually got started in East Vancouver.
Yeah, okay.
Over time, we moved Rocky Mountain down to the Flats in Richmond, British Columbia, and Dan was the first sales manager. He had an old Volkswagen. He drove it all over Western Canada, setting up new customers. So that was kind of, the early days, Dan and I working together.
So you and Joe go and say, Dan, let's cut us in on your new bike company. Is that kind of, what did he say? How did that conversation sort of progress and take shape?
I think Dan and I always had in the back of our minds that we wanted to have our own bike company.
Yeah.
He was doing his thing with Rocky Mountain for a while, and then he started his own thing with the company they called The Bicycle Group in Canada. But I think always in our mind, we wanted to do our own bikes. Again, it's that thought, like, we can do better. Yeah, and back in those days, when you were importing bikes, there were a lot of flaws in bikes. This is back in the days when you still had ball bearings and, adjustable cups and cones and things like that. And bikes were coming out of factories with essentially no grease. The wheels weren't properly tensioned. The frames weren't necessarily straight. So there were a lot of flaws in the manufacturing process. And And then the design of mountain bikes back in those days, you had a lot of road companies. They would just take a conventional double diamond frame with a parallel top tube and slap some 26-inch wheels on it and call it a mountain bike.
Mm-hmm.
And so our idea was you really need to get specific as to what a mountain bike does. And with Joe, we developed, the original Konas, which were sloping top tube bikes. That was a novel idea back then, with a really small triangle, a bottom bracket that was higher than a conventional road bike for clearance, and, a fork that was straight instead of a curved fork, because a curved fork was what you used on a road bike back in those days. So we brought some new ideas to mountain biking and kind of ran with it.
So what did each of you bring to the table that, you and Joe, maybe you could have just done your own thing? Why did you go to Dan and say, let's all do this together? And what did you see in all three of you that, added value and sort of complemented each other? What did you each bring to the table?
Well, this is sort of the business side of it. And Joe was not a business partner in the company. He was key, obviously, because he, number one, was well known, and number two, had a really good feel for design. He was capable in doing drawings of bikes. This goes back to the days when engineers still drew things with a pencil on a drafting board. So he could do that. I think between Dan and I, we were friends.
Yeah.
And we had a love of bikes. We rode bikes together. And so just kind of immersed in the whole cycling world, really what it was all about. With Rocky Mountain, there were three partners involved. And this is one of the things that made me leave, because it was an unequal situation. And so what we started Kona as is we're going to be 50-50 in this thing. So we always have to agree. We cannot do anything unless we both agree. And that is really the way it worked. We never had a contract between ourselves. It was just kind of an understanding of this is how we're going to work. I never went to business school. I just kind of figured out how to do things along the way. Dan had a degree in economics, but he was a shit disturber in school, and he will admit it freely. So, it's not like he was, set out to become, a businessman or a captain of industry or anything like that. And I was the same. I was a mechanic with grease under my fingernails. That kind of seat of the pants way of doing things is really what pushed us forwards. And again, having that similar mindset about how to do things, even though we were kind of making it up on the fly, is what worked for us.
Did you have a business plan or anything like that was scribbled onto plate paper, or you just did what felt right?
It was organic all the way. Just like getting a job in a bike shop and then becoming the mechanic and staying on, it evolved that way. It's kind of the way the bicycle industry is, and I don't think I'm uncommon that way. You fall into it and you stay in it. In the early years, there was no such thing as an engineer that understood bicycles, right? It was sort of the other way around. You had engineers who tried to learn how to be in the bicycle business, but generally your engineers learn from the seat of their pants. And the great example is our first engineer, Doug Lefevre, also known as Dr. Do or Dewey. And we named all our commuter bikes after Doug. He was one of the founders of the Deep Cove Bike Shop in Deep Cove, BC. So that's where Cove Bikes came out of.
Yeah, right.
And, the North Shore, as you know, became a hotbed for mountain biking and still is.
Yeah.
So Dewey had founded this bike shop. He wasn't working in the bike shop after we had started Kona. He was cutting grass. He was like a gardener. And he never went to college. He'd never turned on a computer. And we said, okay, Dewey, we'd like you to be a product manager and draw pictures of bikes. And so he just figured it out. We got him a PC. We loaded a CAD program on his computer, and he taught himself how to do CAD drawings of bicycle frames.
What did you see in him that made the leap in your head that he could do this?
Well, he's a bike person. He's totally immersed in bikes. Before he worked for Kona, he would go down to Southern California and visit the Cook brothers or Koski brothers who were in Tiburon and Marin, and buy some frames and parts and bring them back and have them for his bike shop, which was the first mountain bike only store in Canada in 1980. That store was kind of foundational, really. And so I had met Doug when I was at the bike shop, and we would go riding mountain bikes in the University Endowed Lands and on the South Shore, and he'd take us over to the North Shore where our eyes were opened because the trails were just unbelievable. And so again, we had an affinity there.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's just self-taught, really smart. And, there's lots of examples of people like that who have joined the company over the years. Some of the early ones, there's Dick Cox, and to the people who know Dick, or Richard, as his parents called him, as a really key person in the whole world of Kona. Probably has sold more Kona bikes than anybody else ever has. But he was also working as a gardener. He'd never worked in a bike shop, never worked for a bike company. And he came in for an interview because all the real bike people I knew turned me down. They said, you got a weird little bike company here. Why would I work for you?
Right.
You can't pay me enough. So Dick came in for an interview because Dewey said, hey, I know this guy. He'd probably work in sales for you. Dick comes in, riding his bike. Comes in, says, where's your bathroom? I need to use the toilet. Comes back down 5 minutes later and says, where's all your cleaning equipment? Because I just took a dump, I flushed the toilet, and there's shit all over the floor. And so he got hired immediately, of course.
Yeah.
But again, he had no experience doing what he does now. But he is like a legendary person in the world of Kona.
When you say he got hired, of course, what was the of course part about that? He went to go and clean up his mess, or?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anyone who is willing to admit their faults and clean up after themselves has got to be a keeper. The bicycle industry and the bicycle world still is very character driven and personal driven. It's person to person. Machines don't repair bikes. Maybe it'll get to the point where robots can assemble bikes. They can weld frames now, or parts of frames. They can paint frames now, but it's still very personal. And this is the thing that the previous owners ran into. I think they wanted to have a business that's a little more turnkey, that wasn't as quirky as Kona is. That is more, the term, I guess, is transactional. Computers talking to computers, and all of a sudden out the other end, you get a bike. Well, it doesn't work like that. Not yet.
So it really sounds like you hired on culture and people first rather than competencies. Competencies can be learned. Is that kind of your approach to hiring back then?
When you're small, you can get away with it. Right?
Yeah.
People will let you make mistakes. They'll kind of work with you. And, back then, because mountain biking was still kind of new, there were so many flawed products out there, and we made our share of them. I mean, there was a bike one year, a Lava Dome, which was, just a fully rigid hardtail mountain bike. And it had some rims made by Sun, who's a very reputable brand now, but they had started a factory in China and all their rims collapsed. They were just so poorly made. And there was a brake company called Diacomp who was really well known for making great brakes, but the brakes that we put on that bike barely worked. We had a bottom bracket cable guide was welded on the wrong place. We had to get all those fixed. So when we shipped the bike to a customer, they had to rebuild the wheels. They had to install a new cable guide, set up all the gearing again, and install different brakes. If you did that today to a bike shop, they would just say, oh, no, I'm sending everything back. You guys are screwed up. Forget it. but you could get away with it back then. So
Mm-hmm.
all those mistakes we made because we were small didn't kill us.
Right, right.
We just kept going.
How did you get the money to start making your first bikes or sourcing the parts for your first bikes, and then hiring people? Did you guys have savings? Did you go to friends and family? How did that work at the beginning?
Yeah, we had a little bit of money saved up to get it started. I mean, at that point, we had no history, so we couldn't get a bank loan. We were just cheapskates, did everything really cheap. My first desk was a piece of plywood and 6 concrete blocks, as that's why I'm the chairman of the board. But yeah, it was just small, hand to mouth. And again, the really great thing or piece of luck we had was that as soon as a container of bikes came in, bike shops were waiting for those bikes. They couldn't wait to get them. So they came in. Dan and I would spend all night unloading a container and making all the invoices and doing the packing list and the shipping labels. And the next morning, they would all be gone.
Were you sourcing all these from different suppliers and then assembling them in, would it be Vancouver or would it be in Washington?
Yeah, we started in Vancouver. We were in the old meat packing district in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Yale Town, which is very trendy now if you ever go there. Part of it was kind of a custom thing where we would have frames that we had imported from Taiwan, from the frame makers over there. We had a paint shop in Richmond that Paul Brody ran, and he would custom paint them for us. We had parts kits that we would be counting washers and screws and brake pads and stuff like that, and assembling kits and putting them together with the custom frames. And so that was part of it too, that it was kind of a little bit of a unique twist on some of it. And then the rest were standard models that were, more budget priced and, coming in a container from the factory.
When you say custom and, select based on parts and what you want and that to me sounds like it's probably good for cash flow, so you don't have to carry a bunch of inventory. You know exactly what you need, order it. Was that a big part of getting off the ground and doing custom orders, or was that not the intent at all?
I think that was to try to do something special or unique. Working for Tom Ritchie, I had learned how he did that. So I applied a lot of the systems he had in place. He was doing pretty much the same thing. And I think that still carries on with some brands, or used to, even with Santa Cruz, at least until quite recently, they were doing kits. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it worked. And I think for a bike shop, that's sort of a fun thing. Custom build and maybe tweaking the bike a little bit. That's one of the most fun things about running a bike shop is turning a bike into something that's really unique for the rider. Rather than something that's just off the shelf.
Yeah, yeah. And when you started importing like complete bikes and containers full of things and that starts to take a lot of cash and credit and whatever facility. How did you manage that in the early days? Were you just growing off retained profits, or were there bank loans and credit loans that were needed, or what was that start of that sort of
this is
world?
Where Dan comes in, because he's really good at sweet talking bankers.
Okay.
And he understands their language, and combined with a good pitch and a relatively good understanding of how business works, I think you can kind of get into having a line of credit or a relationship with a banker. The bank that we started with in Canada in 1989, we're still with that bank.
Wow.
So we stayed with the same bank that whole time. And this is, again, something that has been part of our DNA, is that we don't really flip around very much. The first factory that assembled our bikes for us in Taiwan in 1988 is still making bikes for Kona in 2024. They do great work, but they also understand us and we understand them. So that kind of relationship where you know how to work with each other is really important. And the same thing is with the second main factory in Taiwan. We've been working with them since 1994. So longevity in a relationship is really, I think, key. It may not work for everybody, but it certainly works for us.
How did you get onto the first factory in Taiwan back in the early 90s or 80s? Like, you would have had to go over there. There's no doing what we're doing now on Zoom. How did you get hooked up with them originally?
Early 1988, Dan bought a suit. And he got on a plane and he flew to Taipei. I think back in those days, you can go straight to Taipei. I think he went through Narita in Japan.
Yeah.
He had one introduction with a fork maker who made the first Kona fork, that straight, rigid fork that Joe Murray designed, called the Project 2, and we still make that fork. So that we call it Project 2 because that was our second project. The first project was Joe's design of a sloping top tube mountain bike frame. And that fork company, the owner, said, go see these guys in Taipei. They're going to be a great partner for you. They're my friends. And so that's really how it started. That's how Dan picked that factory. He visited a few others, but he went with that one, and it turned out to be a great choice.
Yeah, wow.
I want to tell you one more story about Vancouver.
Please.
About that original building. This is a good one, and it's actually very timely because we were in that building. It's like an old warehouse building with a freight elevator where you're got the pull down doors, all big wood timbers. And on the night of Tiananmen Square, so this is 1990, sorry. I get a phone call at 3 a.m. from the alarm company. Says the alarm's going off. Okay. So I jump in my old Volkswagen Rabbit, and as I'm pulling out, and I'm living kind of a little bit outside of the downtown area, a fire truck goes by. And like right away, I knew something was bad, was really happening. So I followed the fire truck all the way to our building, and it's like engulfed in flames.
No.
It's an 8-alarm fire. There's fire trucks everywhere, shooting water at the building. Like it's gone. I mean, it didn't burn to the ground, but no one was allowed to go into that building. And all our stuff's in there, right? I mean, we have insurance, and that's the first thing the banker calls and say, hey, I'm just looking at your insurance policy. It looks like you're okay. And we say, thank you. And we're standing there looking at the building, and one of our competitors walks by, and he's laughing, right? Like he thinks we're toast. So 2 nights later, we get my Volkswagen Transporter. We put a ladder on the roof and bring a friend and a couple of hockey bags. We're going into the building, right? So our friend distracts the security guard. We climb up the ladder. We go in through the window, and we like load our laptops and whatever other things. Like I think I had a campy front derailleur that I, for some reason or other, was holding on to. I threw a bunch of stuff in the bag. The security guard finally figured out what's going on. He pulled the ladder away, called the cops, and then the cop came. They put the ladder back up. We climbed down the ladder with our hockey bags on our shoulders. We tell him who we are. Don't show him any ID at all. And he says, okay, yeah, you guys go. You're okay. But yeah, everything that was in the building was a total write-off. But the good thing is, and I'm going back to how good Dan was at the whole foundational structure aspect, is we had everything backed up on floppy disks. So the whole business, like all the accounts and everything, is on floppy disks. We've got post-dated checks from our customers. We've got a container of bikes coming in a couple of weeks, and we got a place in another warehouse district of Vancouver, and carried on.
This was late 80s, kind of right at the beginning.
1990. So every year we celebrate the fire party.
Right.
At the beginning of June. But I think it's like you just don't give up. You keep going. And this is something that my cycling coach always used to say, keep going. The pain is worth it. Which I've always taken to heart.
Yeah. Did you think at that moment that it was all gone, that you had lost everything, or were you quite confident that you were going to ride past the pain during the fire?
We had these safeguards in place, right, in case something catastrophic was going to happen. And this is, I think, if you look at business, there's going to be all kinds of flaws, right? You're going to make so many mistakes. It's not funny. I don't think it matters how trained you are, because business is always changing. It's never the same from one year to the next, or one decade to the next, or however far you want to look. But you can't have major flaws. If you have major flaws that are baked into your business, whether it's, borrowing money at an interest rates that's unrealistic, whether it's not having the right insurance, this is boring stuff, right? Not having a trademark in a country where you want to be able to sell your bikes. Things like that are significant flaws. And you have to just watch that you don't have major flaws, right? You don't want your bike to break halfway through a race if you don't have a follow car with a spare bike on the roof.
Yeah.
That's my approach to it anyway. Yeah, no, we never thought we were going to fail. And the other thing too is we just don't want to let people down, right? We had people counting on us. Not that many employees, but we had all these bike shops counting us to deliver the bikes. We had the factories counting us to be able to take delivery of the bikes that we'd ordered, and a number of other things, family too. Yeah, it's just not wanting to let people down has been a big motivator for me, at least.
Yeah, it's a big weight on the shoulders, isn't it?
You have to look at the process. Sorry to bring out one of our bikes' names, but it is about the process, right? It's doing all the little things right, making sure you take care of people, making sure you take care of the details, and then things come together if you do it right.
How did you guys settle on the name Kona? What was that sort of process and conversation? And
another story.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Volcanic theme. That was the concept. And we had actually decided that we wanted to call the bikes Cascade. We actually made a few bikes that had Cascade on the down tube. And then we got a phone call from West Coast Cycles in Los Angeles area, and they owned the trademark rights to the name Cascade. It was a bike model they'd had on the Shiki back in the day, and they weren't using it, which is why it tripped us up. And so they said, well, we'll sell you the name for $3,000. And we said, we don't have $3,000 to spend, so we'll just come up with another name.
Yeah.
And I went to the dictionary and I found all the names that started with a hard C or a K that had a volcanic reference. Dan and I took a look at it and said, yeah, we like Hawaii. We're big on that place, so we're going to call it Kona. It's that simple.
Had you been to Hawaii a few times? Was it a quite close connection? Or
Yeah. I mean, you live on the West Coast, you're probably going to go to Hawaii.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard not to love the islands.
Right.
And Dan has a place on Maui.
This podcast is fully funded by our members at Escape Collective. In fact, all of our content on our website and our podcast network is 100% supported by our members who believe that cycling media should be independent from the sport and industry we cover, and that we should exist to serve you rather than live or die by our ability to be a platform for the sole purpose of selling you more stuff. If you enjoy this podcast or any of our other work and believe in our mission of independence, please go to escapecollective.com/join and become a member today. Thank you for your support. It seems like mid-90s, Steve Pete run a downhill race on a Hey tie frame. Is my timing?
Yeah, a hardtailed
Hardtail.
Hey with probably had like 80 mil of travel in the fork.
How did that come about?
Well, one of the things that we built the business on was having distributors, international distributors. So, 1990, I go to the trade show again in Cologne and set up a booth. And there's a little bit more to the story than that. But we met a lot of people who were in Europe. And this was very early days for mountain biking in Europe. They weren't yet the dominant athletes in mountain biking. They were great roadies, but we just met a lot of people that were interested in mountain bikes, and people came to the booth, and somehow I managed to convince them to give us a shot. Some people I had known from earlier businesses in Rocky or Ritchie or Marin. And at that point, 80% of all the bikes that we were making at the factory were going to these international distributors. And so that was a source of revenue where we didn't need the money. They financed the bikes themselves. We got a little royalty out of it. And that's how we built up the business.
Right. A gentleman named Jimbo Holstrom, I have in my notes, was the one who founded Kona Europe. Is that correct?
Yeah. We met Jimbo in 92. He was working for our Swiss distributor. We talked a lot to him over the years. And in 95, we said, okay, it's time for us to set up our own show in Europe, because we had some distributors come and go. The one in Germany went bust. The one in France shut down. So he said, let's set up our own show in Europe. And we knew Jimbo from his time with the Swiss distributor. And he helped us set that up. So he was our partner in Europe. And, first it was in Germany. And then he said, hey, guys, let's move it to Monaco. And he's a really smart guy. He doesn't like paying tax. So he had a place in Monaco. He had some experience being in Monaco. So we set up shop there, and he built the European operation.
So this was a subsidiary of Kona, not a distribution agreement. This was...
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The three of us owned that part equally. Now, this is one of these unequal things, but it worked out okay because, again, like-minded people who don't need a complicated arrangement to do business with each other. It worked, and Dan and I kept the North American part of it because we'd expanded into the United States by then. We set up our own shop just across the border in Whatcom County. But it made sense to move into Europe and set up our own show there. And over time, as distributors kind of fell by the wayside, we would take over the distribution in that country and kind of built it up. So it became a really key place for Kona as mountain biking started to take off in Europe, and especially in the UK. We had a really great representative in the UK they were really into it. They were the ones who found Steve Pete and got him on a hey. And over the years, they helped us get some really terrific athletes. Tracy Mosley is another one who was a downhiller for us in the Fabian Burrell days. She won a bunch of World Cups on Kona. This is when we're making real downhill bikes.
Yeah.
Not these
the hardtail downhills.
not these pretend downhill bikes. So yeah, we've always had a great connection to the UK, and I think part of it is a lot of terrain is similar. I mean, they don't have the super long climbs like you get in BC, but that wet, rooty, rocky kind of mud terrain that's very similar to what we ride on in the Pacific Northwest. And so there was a really good affinity there in the UK.
When was the free ride mountain bike scene starting to really pick up? Would that have been mid-late 90s? And did Kona you guys were on the bleeding edge of that. Like, how did that all come about? And what kind of ride did you guys have on that with identifying this market and being in the middle of it? Tell me about that time.
Part of it has to do with a key person in the company, Patty White.
Okay.
And Patty is from Wyoming. but he was working in the bicycle industry. He was actually criterium racing, but he was also into motocross racing. And he started working for us in our little titanium era that we had. But he was polishing titanium frames, and then he went to work for somebody else, and then he came back and was working in sales, and then he left again, and then he came back as a product manager. And because of his background in motocross and competition, he helped, along with Dewey, develop our first dual suspension, long travel, heavy duty downhill bike. He was racing the Mammoth Lakes Kamikaze and doing some World Cup events back in the early days. And so that was like single chain ring, whatever the number of gears were on the freewheel you had back in those days, 7 or 8, hooked up with a really good downhiller from Spain with our Spanish distributor, a guy called Tommy Misser, who won some World Cups.
Yeah.
That's when we started developing our own dual suspension design, because we were a little late to the party with dual suspension. We dabbled with a few designs. They weren't really working out. Finally, we settled on this swing link 4-bar system that is kind of common now for Kona dual suspension. And then one day, we're talking to Jimbo, and he says, "Hey, could you put a triple chain ring on that stab downhill bike?" And so Patty and Dewey kind of trying to figure out how to do it, and they figured it out. And that was basically that stab bike. We put a triple chain ring on it, and that was the first Stinky.
Yeah.
In the late 90s, 98. And I remember it really clearly because that's when Ross Rebliati won the dual slalom snowboard race in Japan.
Yeah. I haven't heard that name in ages. Yes.
And, it's the whole secondhand smoke story. And Ross contacts us and say, "Hey, I hear you got some downhill bikes." And I know we got these Stinkies here. And that was like the first, long travel, 5 inches front and rear.
Yeah.
And that was the Stinky 5. So it was early days for freeride, but also, again, being in this area where you've got steep climbs and descents. And, back then it was hair raising. And it's even before all the woodwork started being built on all those trails, what became known as North Shore style trails or North Shore riding. So the bikes really fit that type of riding, because before people were riding dual suspension bikes with not much travel, breaking them. I mean, just breaking everything, including their bones. And the bikes just weren't really cutting it as far as the terrain was concerned. So the bikes really made sense to us.
And the triple, was that because of the short, sharp inclines and people weren't doing shuttle runs at the time? Was that the rationale behind it?
Yeah,
it seems crazy right now. Triple. Why would anyone want a triple? But it made sense back then with the way the gearing was and the way they rode.
Again, it was, people would look at those early freeride bikes and they're like 40 pounds, 45 pounds. Yeah. They're heavy.
Yeah.
They're as heavy as today, an e-bike today. And they looked at them and said, these are the stupidest things ever. It's kind of like back in the early mountain biking days, right? The bike didn't make sense to so many people, but it made sense to us because of where we were and the kind of extreme conditions that we rode in. The rest is kind of part of mountain biking history. The North Shore became a center for mountain biking for a while. It was a hotbed. And that really ramped up our business in a big way.
That's where you started to see significant growth? Is that kind of what you're saying, or?
Well, at one point, one model, the Stinky, was 10% of our total sales.
Is that right?
We couldn't make enough of them.
How many models would you have at that time?
Oh, I think we might have had 30. We always like to have a wider range of bikes. We didn't like to get stuck too much in a niche, even though people thought Kona was a niche bike brand, because we made heavy duty bikes that didn't break very easily. We built bikes that were kind of around that original design of being long and tight, perform as well as any bike would in those days, but kind of conservative streak we have is you don't want a major flaw. You don't want somebody riding your bike and breaking it and getting severely hurt or dying. Right. That again, it's like, don't want to let people down. Don't, want to be somebody that you can rely on when you're thinking about a bike.
So through this growth spurt, or part of growth with the North Shore scene exploding, was that a challenge to keep up with demand of bikes and cash flow and all that? Or was this just bootstrapped and lines of credit and you were able to easily do this and sales were propping the company up quite organically? Is that the situation you were in, or is it not that simple?
It's always been organic, and we've never really tried to push the growth of the business. We like small companies. I mean, I know that there are people who were in the business that wanted to push it and said, hey, we can do a lot more. We can grow a lot more. Let's do bikes like this. Let's add more people doing that. But, there's a certain size where a company gets to, and then you have to take it to another level. Mm-hmm. And we resisted that.
How did you anticipate, without the experience, or to resist that? Like, why did you resist that? Because I think it's in many people quite, anyone with not anyone, but like ambitious people who do what you've done often want to get and see how far they can go. What is it in you guys that resisted that and said that that's not such a good thing for what we want?
Right. Yeah, no, we never really were keen on taking over the world. I don't know if it has something to do with being from the Netherlands originally. All right, it's a small country. Small is beautiful. That whole philosophy of being Canadian too. You don't necessarily want to be the noisiest kid in the sandbox.
We love being second best, don't we?
Or fourth.
Or fourth.
That's the Canadian medal, right?
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with being in fourth place. And so, yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the companies that started a little bit before us or after us, they're much bigger than Kona.
Yeah.
They wanted to do it and they knew how to do it. And I think maybe it's that we just didn't really know how to do it. And secondly, we didn't really want to.
You and Dan must have needed to be quite aligned on that because, culturally, American and Canadians are generally a bit different that way. Was that something you guys were always on the same page with?
More or less.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you look at what you do for your working life, and it's quite a significant amount of your time, our view always has been, let's enjoy it. Right. And that allowed us to do quirky things that maybe even held the company back. We had some marketing ideas that were really goofy, and people said, like, really? You want to call your bike Stinky? That's the worst name ever for a bike.
And why did you choose things like that? What was the rationale? Just fun or a way of standing out?
I guess when you're small, you have to make more noise in a way, right? You have to do things that let you be noticed. So you could do more colorful bikes, or you do bikes that no one else is doing. So it's kind of a contrarian thing too. If everybody is doing things a certain way, there must be something wrong with it. Right? I've always thought that way. And maybe it's the culture that we come from in our youth, is that it was a very contrarian culture of the 60s and 70s, right? It's kind of rebel against the man kind of thing. So yeah, we never really wanted to be big. It just wasn't part of who we were.
I've got really fun memories. This is my heyday of mountain biking. I was always a cross-country racer. We would race on the Sundays and the downhillers would race on the Saturdays and keep us up all night and stuff. That was my fondest memories. And I was living in Canada back then. And I remember you guys had really iconic factory teams with Ryan Trebon, Jeff Kabush, Wendy Sims, Peter Wedge, even rolling green later and that. Tell me about that period and kind of that felt like, at least to me, the height of mountain biking. Was that the height in terms of where you stand and your experience? And what did the mountain bike team, like what did that look like? What did the investment in it, what did running it take away from or add to? I'm curious about that time.
I think if you look at that period, at kind of the run up to the 96 Olympics in Atlanta, where you had the first mountain bikes competition in the Olympics. Up until that point, cross-country mountain biking was a little bit more intimate or a core kind of event. There was no service for the athletes. You know, and originally you were supposed to start and finish on the same bike. And if you had a mechanical, you fixed it yourself. So that's like the original philosophy of what mountain bike cross-country racing was all about. And that is something that resonated for us. You know, it started changing and we tried to change with it. And we added some, you know, really excellent athletes to the team. There was Leslie Tomlinson racing for us. Dave Weens raced for us for a while. An old friend who actually went back to the Joe Murray days, Max Jones, raced for us. And then, of course, all those, you know, famous Canadians. I mean, you go back to Kirk Mulday, who was Canadian-American. Roland Green, of course, like you mentioned. Peter Wedge, who won the Canadian Cyclocross Championship 7 times.
Yeah.
Wendy Sims, who won several times herself.
Yeah.
So yeah, we did have a lot of fun with that cross-country team, and we were, you know, making a shot at having a team that could compete in World Cup events, and they were, and not necessarily winning. I mean, you could even go back to Ryder Hesjedal, who raced for us for a couple of years.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, we were almost like a farm team, to tell you the truth. Once an athlete got to a certain point, and a company came along, like Trek or Specialized, and said, you know, here's more money. We would say, take the money. You know, your career as an athlete is only so long. You go for it and you achieve whatever you can as an athlete. So there were never any hard feelings that people left because they could get more money. You know, we would just kind of start all over again and find younger riders who were newer to the sport that didn't cost as much money to have, so that we could afford to do it.
Were the teams a drain on the business at all, or did you see a bump in sales because of being in that highly competitive space?
That's the other part of your question is, does sponsoring an athlete help you sell more bikes? I think it definitely gives you credibility as a brand. We would joke that, you know, when an athlete wins a race on your bike, it shows that they didn't lose because they're on your bike, right? The bike didn't keep them from winning. The athlete wins. It's not the bike. The credibility is important too. And some of the feedback you get from athletes is helpful. Not always, because you're not necessarily selling bikes to a sponsored athlete. You're selling it to someone who is, you know, an enthusiast, but not necessarily, you know, a highly serious competitor who wants to go on and be a pro athlete. But it never got to the point where we couldn't afford it. You know, it was always within that kind of number that made sense. That was a percentage of total sales that was affordable.
Yeah, it sounds like your whole philosophy on growth is on retained profits, spend what you can afford, and grow organically, and that's worked out quite well for you. Is that a fair statement?
We just kept putting the money back into the business so we could develop more bikes, have some fun, right? I mean, we have distributors in 20 countries. We, you know, 3 years ago when we sold, we had 1,000 bike shops in North America and Europe. So that's a great opportunity to travel around and go riding with people, or have them come to you and hang out and ride with them and party a little bit. Again, it's part of that enjoyment of your work that's so important. Not like your work is necessarily your only part of your life, but again, if you're going to do it, you might as well enjoy doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I know you keep drawing me back into all the numbers, and I can read a balance sheet. I can do a cash flow. I understand how to read a bank facility statement and all that kind of stuff. But that's the boring part of business, right? You got to do it. You got to have an insurance policy. You got to have your trademarks. You got to have a deal with your steamship company and your customs broker and all those boring things that have to be there as the foundation of your business. But the other side, making bikes, figuring out how to make them, coming up with new ideas, getting people to blossom with their creativity and create new ways of making bikes that are adapting to where the sport is going. And, doing some funny things with your marketing, like that's the fun part of the business. And that's the part that I think anybody who's in it really cherishes being part of.
Well, you're very understated, Jake, because I can only imagine the complexity and enormous just challenges of running a business with 20 distributors and dozens of employees and global and everything you have to deal with that. So well done. I mean, you make it sound very easy, but I know it wouldn't be. Jumping ahead to COVID, and I've missed 20 years of stories there, but I did read a quote by you, and I don't want to throw anything back in your face or anything like that, but I just want to take you back to the time. And I read a quote in Bicycle Retailer that you said about strong government advocacy or strong government advocacy, industry support indicate this bike boom will have a much longer trajectory than the 10-speed boom in the 70s and the mountain bike boom in the 80s. Take me back to the COVID boom. And was this something that you thought that was different from any other trajectory in cycling that you've seen? And were you, in hindsight, guilty of being misled by that?
Well, the pandemic boom was certainly the biggest boom that I've ever experienced in the bike business. We had the 10-speed boom, we had the mountain bike boom, we had the free ride boom, we had an e-bike boom, had a gravel boom, but those were all small compared to what happened in the pandemic. The pandemic, everything sold. No one had anything left in their warehouse. Even the bikes that were 10 years old were gone. And a lot of people took up cycling or renewed their interest in cycling. And I don't think they've lost their interest in cycling. If we look at the participation numbers that various organizations provide in North America and Europe, there's still a lot of participation in cycling. It's still pretty high. The change is that they're not buying as many bikes. The mountain of inventory that existed at the end of the boom, so late 22, was enormous. And when it shifted so fast that businesses could not adjust quickly enough. It was like one day, couldn't make enough bikes. A month later, full stop, right? We don't need any more bikes. People have stopped coming into the bike shop. And I think part of the issue was that during the pandemic, it was very difficult to develop new products, right? The whole supply chain thing just slowed everything down. I mean, even just making the bikes that you've been making all along was hard because of the demands on the entire system and the rising costs of everything. So this is the thing that I think has slowed down the industry because when you've got too much inventory, it's costing you money. Everybody that's holding the bag is not making money. So it's really hard to invest in new developments, which is what the sport needs. The sport is not static. It's always changing. So there really hasn't been a lot of new bikes, new products in the last 3-4 years. So if you're an enthusiast and you've got a great bike and the only option for you is just to buy another one that's pretty much the same as what you've already got, you probably won't. You'll probably just keep fixing up your bike. Maybe you'll buy a new fork or a new pair of cranks or pedals, and you'll wait. You'll wait for something better to come along. I don't blame people for that. So that's where we're at right now. We still have a massive amount of inventory. And it's hurt a lot of companies that are suppliers, brands, especially complete bike brands. It's hurt a lot of factories. What amazes me is that so few people have gone bust. Everybody's hanging in there, right? They just love it too much to give up, right? They just keep going because the pain is worth it.
With your disciplined organic growth up until the point of COVID, did you make any mistakes in hindsight with whether getting excited or just trying to keep up with this newfound demand? Were there any things in hindsight that you could have done differently that, I don't know, maybe not even in hindsight, but with the choices in front of you right then and there?
Yeah, I don't know if, and I've thought about this quite a lot. I don't know if there was a winning strategy during the pandemic. I mean, certainly you could win during the pandemic. If you were careful, I think you would have created a little bit of a chest of money set aside for whenever the boom was going to end. That might have been one strategy, and some companies did that, but they still have experienced massive drops in sales. Buying a whole bunch of bike shops, like some of the big brands did, was one strategy. And I'm not sure if that really is successful in the short term. It might turn out to be really successful in the long term, but not participating in the boom would have meant you missed out. If you said, okay, you know what, this isn't going to last very long. We're just not going to order anything for a while, and we'll wait for all the prices to stabilize, and then we'll go back in. So you would have sat out for a couple of years. So you would have lost out there. That might have been a big mistake in hindsight.
What was your thinking with how long this might last internally?
Well, we knew it was going to end. And to be able to keep making bikes, you had to get in the queue. And so you're relying on all your suppliers to deliver things in a reasonable fashion. Not all of them could even tell you when they were going to make stuff, but they just kept taking orders. But there was a window of cancellations. There was the opportunity to say, okay, actually, when the pandemic stops or slows down, we're just going to cut. And I'm sure a lot of brands, and Kona wasn't unusual, is canceled a lot. And in spite of the massive cancellations that were going on as the boom was ending, there still was too much inventory. And so I don't know if there was a strategy. Maybe in a couple of years, we'll find out who the winners are.
Yeah.
But right now, I can't see what it was. When we had the last downturn, 2010, the strategy for the big players was to give really long payment terms to their dealer customers.
Okay.
6, 9, 10 months.
What was that downturn due to?
That was like an economic downturn. Just sort of a general economic global meltdown, so to speak, in financial markets that affected everything. And so that's when, it was possible to slow your business down. And that's what we did back then. We saw that, oh gosh, we've got too many bikes. We're just going to have to cut to the chase really quick, lower the prices, move the inventory, clean it up. It's great for consumers, probably great for bike shops too, but not great for the brands. And just kind of start over again. And that too was a period where Kona was struggling a little bit with product development. And we'd been a bit stagnant in the mid 2000s. We just thought, well, hey, this free ride boom is going to last forever. We're so far ahead of everybody that they'll never catch up. And we were a little complacent. We got that wrong. And then all of a sudden it became so easy for people to imitate you or make something that's a little bit better than what you're doing. And we didn't add enough or invest enough in our product team at that time.
Right.
And so then we started trying to catch up, but we were behind the curve. And it really wasn't until about 2014, 2015, when we came out with the first range of process, that we started to catch up again. So it took basically almost 10 years to kind of take the hit and then build it back up again. So, when you take a long view of business, you can do that.
January 2022, it was announced that you sold the business to Kent Outdoors. Tell me about the conversations and process that led up to that. How did it come about?
Well, it's something we'd never done before. I've never sold a business before, neither at Dan or Jimbo. So it took some time to figure out how to do it. And because it was the pandemic boom, everybody was really horny for bikes. A lot of different scenarios were presented to us. Billionaire, a strategic partner who has 10 other brands, a straight private equity firm who just wants to make a play.
These are different options, are you talking about, or?
Those were some of the options that were presented to us, all right? Because people, like I said, they were horny for bike companies. It was like a super cool thing.
Investors were approaching you guys unsolicited.
Yeah,
that's
wow. Right.
Right.
We're getting on. We're not going to be doing this forever unless we live forever. And so it just seemed like the right time to actually listen to those opportunities. And so when this was presented to us with Kent and they wanted to turn their water sports business into an outdoors company, actually just the private equity firm behind it had just bought Kent and they were going to buy a boat, the stand-up paddleboard company, and they wanted to buy us. And we met the CEO. That's Ken Meidel, who is still in the bicycle business. And I think he was a mountain biker. I think he loved cycling and perhaps was kind of a guiding force in Kent wanting to acquire Kona. And we met him and felt that there was an affinity there. And so that's really what tipped us over in doing the deal with Kent. If it wasn't for the hangover of the pandemic, I think Kent could have been much more successful with Kona than what happened. I think because of the complexity of the business, it just unsettled them when all outdoor businesses were under a lot of pressure. And because Kona, again, had that quirkiness that didn't exactly fit with a little bit more corporate structure of Kent, I think that's probably, in the end, what made them decide that it just wasn't a good fit for them.
How was the culture between the two businesses? Because it definitely sounds like Kona had a very unique small business, maybe culture of, very, very unique. And what was the culture of Kent Outdoors being larger?
I think the original culture of Kent was kind of scrappy, like Kona, very entrepreneurial. And over the years, the founders of Kent added businesses to their roster. So I think the intent was that you could take all these companies together and find some synergies, whether it's freight program or insurance program, centralize some functions, but maintain character of all the parts of it. So I think as that structure was getting built, perhaps there were a few bumps in the road. I think people were actually at Kona looking forward to the structure supporting the business and allowing it to get to another level that Dan and Jake and Jimbo were never going to take it to. Because Kona certainly at that point had the potential to become a bigger player in the business. It didn't work out that way, unfortunately. It's become smaller. It's, kind of back to where it was in its more quirky iteration 10 or 15 years ago in terms of size. So that's where we are today. I think there are definitely a lot of challenges in rebuilding the company after the hit that it's taken. Recently, it's really been more the last year and a half. But if you look at the support that exists for the company because of the relationships from all those years and, all the great stories people have, you read a lot of people saying, well, I had a Kona back when I was 10 or 20. And, they remember that with some fondness. So there are people cheering for the company and the brand.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think is going to carry us for a little while. And then we have to make sure that we don't let anybody down.
You said, we are the smallest big business one of the smallest big businesses in the world, or something like that, to that effect.
I can't remember the order, or the biggest small bike company.
Biggest small bike company, yeah. I like it.
Whatever that was.
Did the COVID boom, the approach for investment, did it start to raise new ambitions in that regard? To grow and take it to another level, like you mentioned, or were you quite happy with where it was? And everyone has their own lifespan of running a business. Were you kind of looking to take a step back, and was that were those things that made the decision to sell to Kent?
I personally wasn't that keen to retire. I like working. I like the people I work with. I like our customers. I love the sport. I mean, I like to tell people I was born on a bike, because the first thing I remember is sitting in a basket on my mom's bike in the Netherlands, riding down to the beach. And I've never stopped being on bikes. So again, it's that affinity for cycling. Maybe it's a little boring, but that's kind of who I am. But yeah, I stayed on in the business. I was on all the way until Kent sold it in a diminished role, because they didn't want my help, and Dan and Jimbo, they didn't really want their help either. But what I really wanted to see Kona do was get to the other side, to get to the other side of this hangover, which has been so damaging for the industry of cycling. And it's going to get there. And it was one of the motivating factors to jump back in and do the buyback.
How did it feel working in a diminished role after 30 whatever years of running the company? How did that feel?
Well, for about 2 hours during the last 2.5 years, I started thinking I could probably get used to the idea of retirement. But that passed.
Yeah.
I just like to put my shoulder into things and make things happen. But like I was saying, the motivating factor here is to make things right. To make things right for the company, the brand, the employees, all the dealers, the suppliers. And a lot of people are in a hard place. We've kept almost everybody on in North America. Nobody got a pay cut. We brought some of the people back in who left or got let go, that were actually a key part of the business and will be a key part of the business in putting it back together again. The head of our marketing team, the head of our IT department, some key salespeople, one of the key product managers. So the people got hurt a little bit. Maybe that, I think it was a tough period for many. And I think the fans, perhaps, who were on the inside and watching it closely, were a little sad. And that's why they're happy now and being supportive. And again, I feel like we can give them reason for being supportive and wanting us to succeed. I feel like we can do it. And certainly whoever is still in the business is quite dedicated to kind of joining right in there with Dan and I and putting our shoulders into it and making it a really healthy business again.
What was the process of buying the business back like? I read that Ken Meidel, the CEO, left in 2023, and I think they had struggles finding leadership after that. Did things change quite a bit after that? And then after Ken left?
When Kent got to the third CEO and the fifth CFO, is when I think some stability started coming in.
Right.
Lee Belitsky, who's the CEO now, is a very straight shooter. When he had his first town hall with all of the Kent employees 2 months ago, he really didn't pull any punches, but he's not a mean guy. He's just a straight ahead business person who has a lot of knowledge and experience. And he, I think, figured out pretty quickly that Kona was not something that Kent wanted to continue to invest in. And I know when he told people that, and then we had the embarrassment at Sea Otter, a lot of people were feeling like, oh my goodness, this is the end of Kona.
That embarrassment at Sea Otter Jake is referring to is something most of you listening will have fresh memories of. The Sea Otter Classic is North America's largest industry and consumer gathering that kicks off the season each April. On the eve of the event, reports were coming out that the CEO of Kent Outdoors called all the employees and told them to break down the display and not have a presence at the expo. It led to mass confusion, adding credence to the rumors that Kona was in deep financial trouble because of the after effects of the pandemic and mismanagement.
I don't think anybody can really explain what happened. It certainly was very public. I don't think anything quite that publicly embarrassing has happened to a bike brand since Schwinn announced their bankruptcy in the middle of the Cabda show in 1992. So here, that chalk one up for Kona as doing something special. But as a joke, I was saying to people, Kent's going to sell Kona, probably going to get a good owner who really cares about bikes. But the problem is, like, who would be crazy enough to want to buy a battered up old bike company right now? Like, it's the worst possible time. That's a bit of a joke.
I see the irony.
Obviously, we were already talking to the folks at Kent about possibly buying it back because we were probably the only ones who would be crazy enough to do something like that.
Was that thought crossing your mind before the town hall with the new CEO, or was that kind of when you found out that they're looking at selling Kona?
Yeah, I mean, I started thinking they probably would want to sell it when Lee took over. But then when he finally did announce to the staff and the industry that they wanted to find an owner or wind it up, that's when things started happening really fast. And they happened super fast. 2 weeks, as a matter of fact, from the letter of intent to closing.
And how did you go about, what were your first phone calls? How did you go about buying this back? Selling a business is difficult. Buying a business is also difficult. And you said you had done neither really of either.
No experience in buying a business.
And you've done it in 2 weeks. What was that process like for you?
Well, again, it's that boring stuff, lawyers, accountants, bankers.
Finding millions of dollars, I'm guessing.
The biggest part was making sure that we were going to be able to take care of the suppliers and getting their support.
Mm-hmm.
That was the big one. That was really important. But we had people who had helped us with the sale and we got them to help us again.
Yeah.
It's not like we were planning to buy it back when we sold it. Like I said, I was just wanting to see it through and get Kona to the other side of the bust. Dan and Jimbo were happy to move on and let a new generation take it on. The thought there was Kona was going to be a bigger and stronger and better bike company.
What are some misgivings that have happened over the past couple of years that you feel you need to correct, maybe to your customers, suppliers, dealers, any of your stakeholders?
Well, right now, there is a lack of supply. There really hasn't been refreshed inventory in staple products for some time, but also that is customer service product, warranty parts and frames.
Right.
And so that has let some people down. That's something that needs to be rectified pretty quickly. And that's what we're working on. The one thing that we're a little concerned about, and we haven't kind of come to terms with it, is all the bikes in the direct-to-consumer program that were sent to consumers in boxes. And they were not reassembled. So we are concerned about people's safety. And so we're putting a program together to make sure that everybody, has a safe bike, regardless of who they bought it from. But yeah, it's the customer service aspect on the warranty side, but also the sales side. And then there's all the product too that was never launched. So we're finally going to be able to get around to launching it. We want to hurry up and get those bikes out there. And again, that's the supplier side, the factories that have all these parts that I feel bad about, that they're kind of holding the bag, really. So we want to take care of them. We want to take care of our customers. We want to take care of anybody that owns a Kona and needs help with it.
But a huge challenge in front of you. How does that feel? Like the things you're speaking about seem like they're pretty big. Is it? Have you ever been busier?
Well, I was kind of slacking off for a while there. Didn't really have a lot to do. I was taking care of international distributors. I was still on the trademark and industry reports, but that became less and less needed over the last period.
Yeah.
I like the people I work with. We're going to just dig into it and get it done. That's that Canadian thing, right? Get her done.
That's Jake Heilbron telling us his founding story and what lies ahead for Kona 3.0. Judging by the cycling community's reaction from the events at Sea Otter and the news of Jake and Dan buying the business back, there's a lot of people cheering for them. Kona is a big part of mountain bike culture and history, and there's still a lot of people out there who still care about them. There's some big challenges ahead for Dan and Jake, but if there's anyone who can turn their company around, it's them. Until next time, this is Wade Wallace from Escape Collective, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Overnight Success.